cattle drive era started in about 1866. The purpose of this was to move cattle closer to railheads in order to make shipment of cattle more efficient. Cattle prices were also different depending on the location. Cattle around $5 to $10 in Texas may be up to 5 to 20 times greater in San Francisco. The drives usually covered 10 to 15 miles per day, and depending on distance, cattle cooperation, and weather conditions or terrain, the trip could take anywhere from 25 to 100 days. Often, movements northbound did not have a definite destination, and were also ineffective. However, cattle drives heading west seemed to be profitable. Some issues cattle drivers encountered were threats from Native Americans and weather conditions, including drought, floods, or storms. Stampedes were also an issue. The main trigger for stampedes was lightning, though other factors could trigger stampedes. Stampedes were stopped by confining the cattle. The people that herd the cattle, called drovers, would make circles near the head of the cattle and close in until all cattle were moving in a circle. The first mass movement of cattle was from Texas to a railhead in Chicago in 1866. Farmers in Kansas were concerned that moving and confining cattle would contribute to trampled crops and an easier spread of disease. These farmers formed groups and threatened to shoot the owners, called cattlemen, of any cattle found on their property. Because of these threats, the 1866 cattle drive was ineffective. The cattle were not shipped, but sold cheaply in small herds. Brands and earmarks were the only form of identification at this time. The idea came to America with the first Spanish settlers. Earmarks were a distinct shape cut in the ear of the cattle. To brand cattle, 3 irons were available. The shapes consisted of a straight line and a large and small half circle. These methods were used before the enclosure of herds. Cattle driving and the open range era lasted about 20 years. Overgrazing, drought, and a severe winter in 1886 essentially decimated the open range cattle business in the upper Great Plains. This was around the same time trains and refrigerators came into play. Cattle no longer needed to be moved by means of cattle drives, and could be butchered and stored for a longer period of time. Because of this, the use of barbed wire increased. Enclosures and domestication of cattle became common. Small cattle drives to railheads lasted until the 1940s, though cattle drives today typically happen within a person's property. The cattle are moved from one pasture to another. Horses are still sometimes used to round up cattle, but an ATV is more common. If cattle need to move a longer distance, they are transported by truck. Each state has their own laws regarding open range and fencing. Some laws are more for keeping livestock out, while others are for keeping livestock in. Colorado is one state that has laws regarding the open range. According to the Colorado Department of Agriculture on the State of Colorado website, quote, "Any person who owns livestock in Colorado should follow common sense in fence practices to minimize potential liability. Livestock should have sufficient water and pasture, quickly recover any strays, inspect your fences regularly, coordinate with your neighbors on building and maintaining partition fences, and always maintain proper insurance." The necessity to have a fence to protect your property in rural areas is no different than in urban areas. In urban areas, you need to have a fence if you do not want the neighbor's dogs or kids in your yard, pool, etc. The same rule is applicable in rural or country settings. The difference is the critters trespassing and the volume of space requiring a fence. Protecting yourself is the main idea. Remember, good fences make good neighbors.